Hey everyone, how's it going? So recently I made a video about the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis for Grim Reaper paradoxes and the like, and one of my viewers watched the video and was pretty happy with it, and he invited me to make a more elementary video on the topic on his channel. So this is my attempt at doing that. So the videos I make are usually for the small group of friends that asked me to make my YouTube channel in the first place. And so I make them with assumed foreknowledge and pre-knowledge based on kind of like our internal discussions and what we've been talking about on the Discord server and things like that. But I noticed I've been getting some new subscribers lately, and I'm really grateful for that. And people might not know all the stuff that we've been talking about. So a good intro video like this for a topic as complicated as the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis um, would be pretty helpful, actually. So I think I'm pretty happy with how these notes turned out, and I'd like to get started. So hopefully this will bring you into the Grim Reaper paradox and kind of like the meta game about the discussion about the paradox. You can see like where the sides stand and why the paradox is relevant and so on. So hopefully this will be very clarifying for people, and I can't wait to see what people think. Okay, so here we go. So the Grim Reaper paradox is part of a broader family of paradoxes called Bernadetti paradoxes. Now, I didn't know that was pronounced until I saw Alex Malpass talking with Joe Schmidt of Majesty of Reason, and they started saying the name Bernadetti, and I'm like, oh, that makes a whole lot of sense. So Bernadetti wrote a bunch of papers about a bunch of paradoxes that have a very similar structure and form, and you can find papers analyzing the form of these paradoxes at kind of a meta level. If you go to Rationality Rules last response to capturing Christianity in their Kalam debate, there's like a wealth of links in the description because Joe Schmidt helped him out a bit in writing that response. And so there's a good lit review in there and all sorts of stuff that's really fun to look at. Now, why these paradoxes are useful is because we want to make a philosophical model of cause and causal history. Now, the real world's really complicated, and models, whether it's economics or science or anything else, models are kind of like low resolution views of all the complex stuff in reality that hopefully gets at the heart of what we're trying to describe. So, insofar as these rules called Bernadetti rules are simple versions that we hope accurately illustrate what we mean by cause and causal history, they're relevant to talk about, and the paradoxes generated from them are relevant to talk about. So, okay, but before we get started, the number one mistake, I mean, I hesitate to say mistake because PhD philosophers talk like this, and it grinds my gears as a mathematician. So maybe as philosophers, they're not making mistakes, but as a mathematician, every time I see it, I go, um, they talk about infinite unordered sets in Bernadetti paradoxes. And they're not wrong, but I feel it's incomplete. So, to preempt the Grim Reaper paradox a little bit, what we're going to talk about is a sequence of Reapers that goes out with an attempt to kill some poor guy named Fred. And there's an infinite number of Reapers that show up at different points in time. So you've got, one that shows up at 11 p.m., 10:30 p.m., 10:15 p.m. And time keeps getting cut in half and half and half and half and half. So an infinite numbers are squeezed in there between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m. to come after poor Fred. Now, there's a difference between that sequence of Reapers ordered in time and the set of Reapers that they're being pulled from. So the set of Reapers being pulled from isn't ordered. It's probably not indexed. You may not even be able to distinguish one Reaper from another Reaper, right? So sets are very general things. So you can have sets of numbers, sets of propositions, sets of chairs. Uh, and then where things get real and where the Bernadetti rule actually works to apply them is when you've actually got a sequence. And where this is really, really relevant too is we're going to talk about one of the solutions to the Grim Reaper paradox later. And it doesn't solve the paradox by changing the number of Reapers, either in the sequence or the set. It actually doesn't modify the set of Reapers that makes a sequence at all. All you've done is kind of ordered the arrangement of the Reapers and given it an extra rule. And that turns out to solve things. So we have to be able to have higher resolution language that talks about manipulating ordered sequences of objects without ordering the set that we're pulling the objects from. And I think if we start consciously making that distinction, conversation about this topic will evolve in a hurry. So this is my own pet peeve. I want to take a minute to talk about that. So okay, let's talk about the Bernadetti rule. The Bernadetti rule is a rule that applies to a sequence, and it's an if and only if rule that applies to some property. Now, you can talk about rules of things that apply to everything before a member or to everything after a member. So, um, good examples of this would be you have the Grimm messenger paradox that applies to messengers before any given one. You've got Yablo's paradox, which applies to propositions after a given proposition. And then you've got really interesting ones like the Grim Reaper paradox, where as you count up in sequence, the first Reaper, second Reaper, third Reaper, you're going backwards in time. So the Bernadetti rule applies to indexes after your given index, but it's referring to things backwards in time. So the exact form of the Bernadetti rule isn't super important because depending on how your indices go and depending on what sequences you're talking about, it can express itself in a lot of different ways. But the gist of it is that a Bernadetti rule is an if and only if about a property, and some things not having a property as you go in an infinite direction. That's the key. So in the Reaper paradox, a Reaper will kill Fred if and only if no previous Reaper kills Fred. And that's important because there's an infinite number of Reapers going back into the past. So nothing does the property in the infinite direction is key to what makes a Bernadetti rule work and why it generates the paradoxes that it generates. And hopefully we'll explain why that is later and it'll make some sense. Okay, so let's talk about the anatomy of the Bernadetti rule. So I talked a little bit about the generality of the rule before, um, but let's talk about the logical structure of the sentence to really break it down. So first thing to note is a Bernadetti rule is always an if and only if, which means there's an if portion, there's an only if portion, and there's a conjunction of the two. So you can kind of split them apart. Now, um, the example I use to help kind of distinguish these is if you give me $4, then I'll give you a taco versus uh, I'll give you a taco only if you give me $4 or something like that, right? So there's two ways to think about this. An only if swaps the order of an if then. So if I say if P then Q, and I say P only if Q, the order gets swapped to be something like if Q then P. In philosophy, this is distinguished between necessary and sufficient conditions. So let's talk about that here. So let's talk about the sufficient condition first. If you give me $4, then I'll give you a taco. What that means is that the $4 you put on the counter is sufficient for me to make your taco. I don't need anything else. The second I see that money and take it, out comes your taco. No ifs, no ands, no buts. If I take that money or you give me that money and still don't get a taco, then I've lied. There's a lie in there somewhere. Something's wrong. There's a glitch in the matrix. Now, the other side of this is if you swap them. If I make you a taco, then you give me $4, right? Now we've swapped the order. That might seem like a little thing, but it's actually a really big thing. What this means is that my giving you the taco is sufficient for getting your money. So there's two ways you can think about this, right? One way is that in this instance, $4 is necessary for a taco, but not sufficient. So, for example, um, let's suppose somebody was an employee that worked at the taco stand. For them, if a taco was made, then they handed $4, and that's fine. But for you, giving $4 won't guarantee that you get a taco because you're not an employee. Maybe it costs you $5. So there's different ways you can think about this, right? So a necessary condition, the thing on the other side of the then, right? If the $4 on the other side of the then side, what that means is it's part of what makes the if happen. It's part of what makes the taco appear, basically, but it might not be the whole story. It could be $4 and being employee that was sufficient together, and the $4 is only one necessary component of the thing. The other way to look at this, which is funny, is if you swap them, right? If I give you a taco, then you pay me $4. Then what that means is if you go out and just hand somebody a taco, that's sufficient for them to hand you a $4 bill, which is an interesting thing to think about because what if you don't want a taco? You don't want to buy it, right? You're kind of forced to if that proposition is true. So only ifs are very, very different than ifs. Swapping the order does interesting things. And hopefully that gives you some degree of what's going on there. But I don't think that one example is going to be enough. It's going to take a bit of practice. But hopefully through osmosis, kind of, and how I talk about them through the rest of the presentation, you'll kind of get an idea. So, okay, let's keep going. Okay, so for Bernadetti rule, we can split it up as the if and the only if clause as two different parts. So the if part says, if property P does not hold for everything up to or after or whatever a given index, uh, then the property must hold for that particular one. The only if swaps them. So if the property holds for a particular thing, then it can't hold for all the other ones in the relevant direction. So what does it look like using the taco example, trying to piece this together? We have these two rules. What does it look like to break them, right? That's the important question in all this. So what it looks like to break the if rule would be something like your property doesn't hold anywhere else in the relevant direction, and it doesn't hold at the current thing you're looking at here. So it doesn't hold before now, and it still doesn't hold now, right? That would break the rule because what the rule is saying is, look, it's got to happen sometime. So if it hasn't happened yet, it better happen now. To break the rule would be, nah, it hasn't happened and it's still not going to happen, right? That's what the if rule is talking about. But we'll kind of clarify that later. The only if rule would be, well, it holds for this specific one, and it holds for this one before or after, depending on the paradox. So it's holding in multiple places at once in the relevant direction. So it's violating uniqueness. The only if rule part of the Bernadetti rule is about uniqueness. Now, I'm using indices and symbols. It's kind of a pain. Um, for those of you that kind of get it, cool. And for those that are a little confused by this, we'll clarify when we get to the Grim Reaper example because it'll be a little more physical and a little bit more understandable. Okay, so here's the Reaper rule. A Reaper kills Fred if and only if no previous Reaper has already killed Fred. So there you go. No talk of indices, no talk of, general could be before, could be after, right? No wishy-washy stuff. Everything's here. Okay. This is the Bernadetti rule for the Reapers. It's going in the before direction. We have our if and only if. So we're going to split it up. The if rule says if a previous Reaper has not killed Fred, then this Reaper kills Fred, where this Reaper is whichever one you're pointing to, right? Suppose that at 10:15, God comes down and sees that none of his Reapers have killed Fred, right? 10:15 shows up and God says, okay, Reaper, it's your turn. Fred's not dead, make him dead. It's basically what the if rule is saying, right? Hasn't been done yet, so you're just going to do it. The only if rule would be something like if a Reaper kills Fred, then no previous Reaper has killed Fred. And so what that's basically saying is you can't die twice, right? If a Reaper's already got you, the no Reaper after that one is going to get you again. You're already dead. So that one makes some conceptual sense. Okay. Now, we can clarify these rules a little bit more than we already did, right? So the if rule is basically saying, like I tried to elaborate before, some Reaper's gonna kill Fred, right? If it hasn't been done up till now, it's gonna be done now, is basically what it's saying. Some Reaper's gonna get this poor kid. The only if rule says there's no Reaper that appears to Fred before the Reaper that kills him. So if some Reaper finally gets Fred, there's no other Reaper that could have been a candidate to do it. Now, let's think about this, right? What would be the case where a Reaper gets Fred and no prior Reaper could have done it? That's a fancy way of saying the first Reaper gets Fred, right? Because nothing comes before the first. That's the definition of first. So the only if rule can be simplified a little bit more. The Reaper to kill Fred must be the first to see him, right? No Reaper kills Fred if there could have been one before it. Well, there's nothing before the first Reaper. So there it is. So some Reaper gets Fred, and it must be the first one. That's basically what these two rules boil down to. And it's a shame I don't hear the Grim Reaper paradox presented so simply, but that's basically what it is. And once we see this Reaper rule for what it is, we're gonna see why contradiction falls out of this super fast. So I'm going to present like the formal version of the contradiction, how like Alexander Proust and people like that kind of arrive at it. But we're gonna see very quickly with how we reworded these rules, the contradiction just pops right out of it like nothing. So let's go on. Okay, so here's the full setup of the paradox. We talked about the rule, that we've got some nice setup going here, and so when we get to the relevant part, we'll know what to do. But let's kind of hit the reset button a little bit and just talk about the full paradox. So full paradox goes like this. Suppose that between 10 p.m. and 11 p.m., Fred will be visited by an infinite sequence of Reapers who have come to kill him. Now, the 10 to 11 isn't relevant. In my video, I think I said like midnight and 1 a.m. or something like that. The time of day is just an irrelevant detail. Kind of like a math story problem where you've got like a blue car traveling down the freeway. You don't care that the car's blue, right? It's like that. Okay. So times the Reapers show up will be 11 p.m., 10:30 p.m., 10:15 p.m., 10:07 and 30 seconds p.m., and so on. You're just cutting the time in half. So that allows the Infinite Reapers to come and see Fred. Now, Fred will only be visited by Reapers. Now, make a note of all the asterisks for later, right? Everywhere you see an asterisk starting now, if you're wanting to take notes and kind of follow along, the asterisks are good notes to take because there's going to be a twist at the end of this where they become super, super relevant. And you'll be happy that you've kind of jotted them down and pondered them a bit. See if you can see where I'm going to go with this. Okay, so Fred will only be visited by Reapers. Also, if a Reaper kills Fred, then Fred stays dead. Seems like fair enough rules. The Reapers have the Reaper rule, which we previously discussed, and so we'll move on. Derivation of the contradiction. So let's pick some Reaper time between 10 and 11. By Reaper time, I mean like when the Reapers show up. So 10, 11, 10:30, 10:15, so on. So you can't pick like 10:22 because Reaper didn't show up there. Okay. We're going to ask. So we're going to pick 10:30 as an example. Alexander Proust, I think, picks 11. He picks the last one, but it doesn't actually matter which one you pick. The contradiction will fall out at any point in time, which is why it's so powerful. So suppose Fred is alive at 10:30. We'll suppose he's dead in a different one in the next slide. But for now, let's suppose he's alive at 10:30. Well, what would that mean? Well, since nothing can bring Fred back to life if he's killed, asterisk, Fred must have been alive at 10:15 when the previous Reaper came to see him, because only another Reaper could have came to see him at 10:15. Imagine if there's another asterisk in that part of the premise, right? Now, since Fred was alive when the previous Reaper got there, it must kill Fred, right? Because the if part of the Reaper rule, right? So if it gets to 10:15, a Reaper shows up and Fred's still there, the if part of the Reaper rule says, okay, your job, whack him, right? Get rid of him. So Fred should have been dead at 10:30, right? Supposing Fred was alive led to a situation in which he was actually dead, which is a contradiction. That's silly, right? So Note that we can also repeat this for any time, right? If he's alive at 11, then the 10:30 Reaper should have got him and he'd be dead. If he's alive at 10:15, the 10:07.5 Reaper should have got him and he'd be dead, you know. So at every time between 10 and 11, by this logic, Fred should be dead. So the logical conclusion here would be that Fred's always dead. You know, there's never a time where a Reaper doesn't get him. And that makes sense because this part of the paradox is utilizing the if rule of the Reapers, right? What it's saying is that what the if rule is saying is if no Reapers got him yet, then you get him. And so at any point in time you look at, there's always a before then where Reaper could have got him and maybe didn't get him yet. And so if he's alive there, he's not alive. Reaper gets him, right? That goes all the way back to the past. So the logical consequence of the if rule, which will be relevant later, is just that, you know, Fred's always dead. Okay, well, now we're about to see how the only if rule screws that up. So let's look over here, right? Suppose Fred is dead at 10:30 instead of alive. Well, the Reaper that saw Fred at 10:30 must have killed him, right? Okay, fair enough, no problem. But now we've got the only if rule to consider. Since only Reapers can visit Fred, asterisk, then at 10:15 there was another previous Reaper that saw Fred. And due to the only if part of the Grim Reaper rule, right? You kill Fred only if somebody else didn't get him first, right? Okay, well, the 10:30 Reaper couldn't have got Fred because it was the 10:15 Reaper's job to get Fred. Okay, well, let's look at it from the perspective of the 10:15 Reaper. He shambles on up, he sees Fred, he goes, I should get you, but you know what? That was actually the 10:07.5 Reaper's job, and he walks away, right? We rewind back to 10:07.5 Reaper, right? At 10:07 minutes and 30 seconds, some Reaper shambles up, looks at Fred, and goes, not my job. 10:03 was supposed to get you. Walks off, right? Oh, they all go and talk to their union reps, right? Because the Reaper before them shirked their job, right? It was their job. It's part of the contract, right? We get you only if no other Reaper could have got you. Basically, is how the only if rule works for the Reaper paradox. So every Reaper is going to walk up to Fred, see him, and be like, this was the Reaper before me's job. I'm not doing their job. They're going to go talk to their union rep and complain, is basically how it's going to go. Well, since every single Reaper could pass the buck, the Reaper that was supposed to come before them, Fred never dies because there's an infinite amount of buck passing to go around, basically, is what it goes. So no Reaper gets Fred at 10:30 by 10:30, and so why would Fred be dead, right? If no Reaper could have killed him. So okay, assuming Fred's dead, he actually should have been alive. That's a contradiction. But again, we could have repeated this argument at any time between 10 and 11. So what we'd want to say about this is, oh, well, I guess Fred's just going to have to be alive, right? That's what the only if rule tells us, is that Fred will be alive always from 10 to 11. But that leads us to the grand contradiction that ties all of this together, right? From part one that used the if rule, Fred's always dead between 10 and 11. But from part two, which utilized the only if rule, we get that Fred is always alive between 10 and 11. So not only do we have the individual contradictions we derived, we have the grand one, right? We resolved each individual one by saying Fred's always something or other, but it turns out even that didn't work. So trying to resolve our contradictions led to bigger ones. It's just a tangled mess of a paradox. That's why it's a paradox. So now that we've gone through the formal presentation, like you'd see in, say, a Capturing Christianity video or Proust's book or something like that, let's talk about a simplified version of the contradiction. Right? So we can split the Bernadetti rule up into its if and only if portions. And remember how we talked about them, right? The if rule was basically just saying that some Reaper is going to get Fred, right? If nobody's done it, you do it. I don't care. Some Reaper is going to get Fred. The only if part was Fred can only be killed by the first Reaper because only the first Reaper would have no prior Reapers whose job it was to get Fred, right? That's what it boils down to. But since there's an infinite number of Reapers due to the construction of the paradox, there is no first Reaper. And so that's where the contradiction is going to pop up, right? So by 2 and 3, Fred cannot be killed by a Reaper, right? He can only be killed by the first. There is no first, so Fred doesn't die, right? But one says Fred has to die. Some Reaper's got to get him. So some Reaper has to get him. Some Reaper can't get him. It's irreconcilable. And so that's the easiest way to spot the contradiction, right? So many authors that do literature on this always jump to the complicated presentation of the contradiction by looking at a time and marching through it. But if you just look at the rules and break them down into plain English, you just kind of see what's going on, and that's the value of doing that, I think. Okay, so I have another example of a Grim Reaper paradox. So a lot of people tell me when I try to explain this to them, they say, "Well, Logos, this is just a stupid story, right? Why would God send an infinite number of Reapers to whack a dude? And if he's gonna send an infinite number of Reapers to whack some dude, why would he make a rule that says only the first can kill him if there's not going to be a first?" And those are pretty good questions, right? I mean, that version of the story is kind of absurd. So I've done my best to think about this over a couple of days since I've gotten the request to make this video. And I've come up with a story, borrowing from like Kafka novels and Catch 22 and things like this. I think this story is absurd as far as, all in stories about infinity are going to have some degree of absurdity, but it won't be as obviously absurd as God needlessly sending an infinite number of Reapers to whack some dude with this weird rule that keeps them from doing it, right? So let's look at this one. Suppose a company that has been in construction for an infinite amount of time has been seeking job applicants while it's in construction. Ergo, it has an infinite amount of job applicants for a certain position. The company hires an HR representative to fill the position, hire somebody, meaning this representative will have to look through the infinite stack of job applications ordered by most recent on top. So, application one would come in, application two's on top, and so on. But there's an infinitely high stack. Um, so there we go, right? This isn't God sending an infinite number of Reapers when he could have sent one or something like that. There's some necessity that there's an infinite state of affairs going on here, right? That this company was infinitely under construction. Now it's going to be an official corporation. People were applying for work while it was still being built, trying to, early bird gets the worm kind of a thing. And now some poor HR rep is going to have to figure out who to hire in all of this mess, right? So that's a bit more plausible relative to the first one. Okay, so let's see if this works. The other rules are that there are only job applications for this job that are in the stack that's to be looked at by the HR rep. And once the job is filled by an applicant, all later applicants are rejected, right? So we only need one person. Once we pick one of you, the rest of you who applied get canned. Basically, you just don't get the job. Okay. The company has two rules the HR representative must abide by when picking an applicant. This is the analog of the Reaper rule. The job must be filled by someone. That's like the if part of the Reaper rule. And then first come, first serve. You cannot hire a candidate if another candidate applied first. That would be like the only if part of the Reaper rule, right? Instead of saying Reaper kills Fred only if another Reaper didn't get him first, this is like saying, hey, you can't just arbitrarily pick a candidate to hire if there were other ones before. It's first come, first serve. And there's nothing inherently unreasonable about that. We have first come, first serve things all the time. So hopefully that's a little bit more believable version of the only if Reaper rule. Okay. Now we can just without going through the motions of talking about like suppose the fourth applicant is hired or something. We're just gonna jump straight to the end and look at the contradiction. So again, one, the HR rep must hire someone for the job. Two, only the first applicant can be hired. Otherwise, there's a previous applicant. You can't hire the person, right? There's always a previous one. Keep going. But there's no first applicant due to there being an infinite number of applicants, right? The stack just always goes lower. There's no end to it. And that just gives the exact same contradiction as the Grim Reaper paradox. So people who try to dissolve the Reaper paradox by appealing to how dumb it would be for God to send an infinite number of Reapers the way he did, hopefully this version of it is a little less obviously crazy, right? It's not obviously crazy. we'll talk about the absurdities a little bit later. Let me not get too far ahead of myself. Okay, so for now we just see this kind of Kafka-esque kind of bureaucratic version has the same problem. You have a whole bunch of rules that make sense individually, like the first come first serve rule, the just hire me somebody rule, the infinite applications given that you have an infinitely old corporation under construction. Like none of these things are on their own just like dumb, right? It's only together they create oddities. So we'll investigate those. Okay, so we see the paradox and we want to deal with it somehow. And the two options that are usually on the table in the literature are you just the absurd conclusion, where you just say something about the story is so absurd, I'm just going to throw it out without saying the story tells me anything, or that I should work on my worldview in some way to resolve the oddity of the story. The story is just so odd on its face, I just don't have to worry about it. The other way is that you reconstruct the story without absurdity. So you pick some metaphysical position that will address the problems and commit to it. So let's talk about the story, right? Is the story irreparably absurd? Now, one could make an argument that the Grim Reaper paradox, as usually presented, is kind of irreparably absurd. Like the you send an infinite number of Reapers, so there's no first one, with the rule that only the first one kills Fred. Like, what are you doing? Like, that's obviously dumb. Okay. Um, so let's look at this corporate case, because there's no obvious malfeasance there that can kind of diffuse the absurdity of the situation. So, okay, so the first component, is it absurd to imagine there's an infinitely old company? Not on its face, given there are some people who reject premise two of the Kalam. So remember, the Kalam is everything that begins to exist has a cause. Premise two is, well, there's different versions, right? Craig's version is just the universe began to exist because he thinks he can support it with like science, like the Big Bang and stuff like that. Bordguth-Vilenkin theorem, he talks about that all the time. But there are other versions that are a little bit more aggressive, right? So let's say everything that begins to exist has a cause. It is impossible to have an infinite past history of events. So, something like Rob Kuhn's version. Um, but people will reject premise two of the Kalam, and they'll say, well, no, it's possible to have an infinite past, right? So if it's possible to have an infinite past, then it is possible that in this infinite past somewhere, there's some corporation that was just like always under construction, always getting its license, always getting its buildings built, and so on and so forth, and could never hire anybody for an infinite amount of time. So that part isn't absurd given the context in which we talk about these paradoxes, namely one's position on the Kalam. So I don't think that if somebody wants to say employ the absurdity argument to reject the paradox to get them out of this corner the Kalam's panned them into, pointing at this part of the story as absurd isn't going to help them reject the Kalam, because they're rejecting as absurd the core part that they need to stave off the Kalam's premise. So that won't help them. So let's move on. Okay, well, two, is it absurd to think that a newly started corporation might need an HR rep to look at job applications? No. So, uh, a company got an infinite number of job applications due to its, being infinitely in development, and now it's starting. And so some HR rep is going to figure it out and look at it. That's not absurd. Companies use HR reps to deal with backlogs of job applications all the time. Okay. Is it absurd to think there's only job applications in the HR rep stack? No. Is it absurd that if a candidate gets hired, everyone who applied after them fails? Well, no. If you're only hiring one person, then everybody before and after them fails. Uh, is a first come, first serve system absurd? No, we use them all the time for job applications, for tickets to concerts, to all sorts of things. I mean, we have a name for it for a reason. Uh, is it absurd to expect that an HR representative you hire to select an employee does so? Rule number one, right? Hire me somebody. No, right? So you can't point to any particular rule in this Kafkaesque version of the Reaper paradox as like being the thing that's so absurd on its face by itself that the story just tanks along with it. With the Grim Reaper paradox, there's an argument you could do that, right? Like the only if part of the Bernadetti rule made no sense to the story given the rest of the context. You probably could have looked at that rule alone and said, look, given that God's sending this infinite number of reapers to whack this guy, this rule's obviously just serving the purpose of keeping them from doing their job. What are you doing? Right. Okay. So if no element of this story is absurd on its face enough to pull the whole story, some elements of the story are mutually inconsistent and must be amended, right? You have to actually like look at them, figuring out where the tangled mess is and replace one of the bad elements with something you can live with that makes the story work, right? That's how dealing with paradoxes goes. So, the obvious solution, and the one that's aggressively always on the table, especially when the column is concerned, is the finite solution, right? The idea that there are no infinite number of things, period. They're always finite. So they would reject the notion that there was an infinitely old corporation in development. Like, that just doesn't happen. And therefore, if there's only a finite number of time, the corporation's in development, there's only a finite number of people, then there's only a finite number of job applications. And so that whole infinite stack problem is dissolved. If the application process is first come, first serve, there's a first applicant because there's not an infinite number of them, and ta-da, the paradox is done. Very simple, very elegant solution, but if you are a finitist, you are biting the bullet on more than just this paradox when you're talking about mathematical models that work for the real world. You know, Craig brings up like infinite dimensional Hilbert space and quantum mechanics. Like you have to take this weird view where um this infinite dimensional thing doesn't have any ontological status. There's no realness about it whatsoever, but it just so happens to solve or model something in our universe really, really, really well for reasons. And someone like Craig will point to say, well, God made the universe such that aesthetically these models work. It's like, yeah, but what is it about the universe that makes this infinite dimensional thing work if there's no there with respect to infinite dimensions? Like, I don't want to go on this rant because I've made other videos going on this rant. I'm going to try not to. So the point is, some of the odd positions you'll find yourself in as a finitist in certain conversations might end up being more than you can chew. Being you biting more off than you can chew, right? Because you may end up committing to like some nominalism with respect to mathematics. You have a philosophy of time that'll go along with it. You'll have all sorts of things you don't see coming, right? This is why a lot of people who've thought about the Kalam really hard don't want to bite the bullet on finitism. They're like, I see how it's simple, I see how it could make sense, but the cascade of stuff we'll have to commit to is just unsettling. Maybe I want flexibility in how I deal with metaphysical problems like individually that finitism doesn't give me. So that's a good reason why somebody just wouldn't want to be a finitist. Notably, Alexander Proust. Proust is a Catholic, I think, and he makes arguments for God. He's an apologist of some degree, but he's also a PhD mathematician, and he sees no problem with giving some ontological um, license to mathematical entities because of their use in the world, because of their use in mathematics, and how you just can't do mathematics intelligibly without them. And especially if one holds like an Augustinian idea about mathematical abstracta in the mind of God, insofar as mathematical systems are in the mind of God, any infinite underpinnings they're built on would probably equally be in the mind of God. And so, how can you have these like real objects in the mind of God that aren't real because you're a finitist? It doesn't make sense to Proust. So, if you read Infinity, Causation, and Paradox, which is where a lot of this discussion comes from, a lot of that book is just Alexander Proust trying to thread the needle between, hey, these things are weird, we should address them, but maybe we shouldn't go full finitist. So, there's a lot of reasons not to be a finitist. Okay, ranted about that enough. Okay, so suppose you want to suspend one part of the Bernadetti rule instead, right? It's the Bernadetti rule combined with the infinite set that's causing the problem. So we'll just suspend that and we're done. Now, I kind of hinted at the problem with this throughout the presentation, especially near the beginning when I said, look, the reason the Bernadetti rule is the way it is because we hope it gives us some low resolution model of cause and causal history. So if we thought we could get by without it, we just never would have used it in the first place. So throwing out one or both parts of the Bernadetti rule is going to be throwing out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. And we have to figure out what's going on there. Well, remember what I said that for the if rule, like if you just follow the if rule for the Grim Reapers, uh, Fred's always dead, right? But it's worse than Fred always being dead. You you can't point to the Reaper that actually killed him, right? For any Reaper you look at, uh, anytime you look at it and you ask if Fred's alive or dead, well, Fred's dead. Which Reaper got him? I don't know. But if he wasn't dead by this time, this Reaper would have got him. And since you could repeat that argument for the previous time also, that Reaper would have got him, and that Reaper would have got him, and every Reaper would have got him, and he's dead. But we don't know why or which one. So imagine you have a bunch of dominoes, right? If you have an infinite line of dominoes, you flick over the first one and it knocks all the other ones down. If you just have the if rule and you get rid of the only if rule, then what that means is all the dominoes have fallen, right? And we don't know which one like knocked the other ones to knock them down. We don't know who the culprit was. Um, Only allowing the if rule for Bernadetti rules is just forever looking at a set of dominoes that are knocked down with no account as to why. Right? That's kind of the issue there. Um, the only if rule, remember, means that Fred's always alive. No Reaper killed him. So it'd be like looking at a stack of dominoes and seeing that, well, no domino fell. It's just denying that anything causal happened. So it's like two extremes, right? It's like two extremes. One extreme is cause happened, right? We don't know what happened, but an effect just persisted always. And the other rule is frozen time. Nothing caused anything at all. And if you want an idea of a causal history, especially something that makes our universe, like the Big Bang and stuff before the Big Bang and so on and so forth, like only one half the Bernadetti rules aren't sufficient to deal with that. I give another example, right? So yeah, here it is. So imagine an infinite generational chain of children, each lacking parents. They're here, but no account of exactly how, right? That's the if case, right? The if case by itself is like that, and the only if case would just be like imagine if there were just no children or parents. you know, that's kind of what happens if you try to like suspend one of the two Bernadetti rules. You need them both in order to get a decent account of causality and a causal history, right? So something causes something, and something uniquely causes something that causes something that causes something. So you have this history you can point to. This happened, and then this happened, and this happened. You can't get that if you get rid of one half of the rule. Okay. So smart people know this. Smart people know that finitism, maybe don't want to do that, but they can't get rid of the Bernadetti rule. And so the meta for this conversation, the meta game, is something called the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis. And what that does is say, well, look, we know there's some kind of a problem with the Bernadetti rule and the infinite sequence. They're not playing nice together, right? Now, if you just look at the contradiction literature where you look at like each point of time and do it that way, you're not going to see why. You'll see exactly why they don't play nice if you break them down exactly how I did in the presentation. You can point to exactly where the contradiction is. So you can think of that as a good argument for the unsatisfiable pair. Yeah, there's a contradiction going on right here. But why the unsatisfiable pair doesn't work as a solution, and I'm honestly surprised that um, somebody like Rasmussen didn't pin Malpass and Joe on this. Why the unsatisfiable pair doesn't work as a solution is that all the unsatisfiable pair does is look at the two things and go, yeah, there's a contradiction there. Okay, so if a Kalam proponent says that they make like the successive addition argument, the Green Reaper argument, and say, well, look, if there's, suppose there's an infinite path, suppose there's a Bernadetti rule, so we get this contradiction, right? The unsatisfiable pair is going to look at that and go, Oh yeah. There's a contradiction. We know. The Coulomb proponent's going to go, so, and the unsatisfiable pair person's going to have like no answer. Like there's a step after you see there's a contradiction somewhere. Observation at a certain point isn't enough, right? What they want to do is have like some perpetual agnosticism and say, well, we don't know what to say. We observe the contradiction. But what's relevant here is they don't just want to observe a contradiction, especially if they're looking to foil the Kalam. What they're looking to do is say, well, possibly the past was finite or infinite. Sorry, possibly the past was infinite, right? So we don't have to accept premise two of the Kalam, and therefore the argument's thwarted, right? Malpass is big on this. He had that whole discussion with Andrew Locke where that was what he was defending is possibly there's an infinite past. So if you're actually going to make the positive assertion at some point that possibly the past was finite, the unsatisfiable pair is not enough because, yeah, there's a contradiction there, but you also want to affirm one of the halves of the contradiction, or actually suspend one of the halves of the contradiction, right? Or no, you want to affirm it. You want the infinite sequence, right? So that means you have to make a commitment on the Bernadetti rule somewhere. You don't like where it's going to get you, but you're kind of you're kind of forced to. Uh, and it seems to me that the unsatisfiable pair is kind of like a latch stitch effort for them to avoid it, but it's inevitable. So that's my first grief with the unsatisfiable pair. I've got several. So okay, dealing with what doesn't work, what you can't do. Well, you can be a finitist. I don't want to be, but let's put it that way. So here's my preferred solution, right? Causal finitism. Now, if you watch Malpass and Rasmussen and Joe talking about this, causal finitism is kind of put up against um, the unsatisfiable pair is kind of like a foil, right? So this will be kind of hard to explain, but there's this idea called the patchwork principle in modal logic. We can kind of glue possible states together. So possibly there's one reaper with a Bernadetti rule. Possibly there's two reapers with a Bernadetti rule. For any k reapers with a Bernadetti rule, possibly there's one more. And then once you've got that, you've got induction. So possibly there's this infinite number of reapers with a Bernadetti rule. Now, the Bernadetti rule is there in all cases, right? So for one reapers, two reapers, three reapers, for every k plus one. The problem there is when you move to induction, you say, well, okay, but the infinite reapers with the Bernadetti rule is the problem. And we've had the Bernadetti rule all along with no problems before this. So the infinity is the problem. And so what Rasmussen will say is, that's why causal finitism. We can't have an infinite number of reapers. It's like, well, hold on. Causal finitism says absolutely nothing. 100% does not talk about the number of reapers whatsoever. Okay, I want to make this clear to the audience right now. If you read Proust's book, Proust does not mention a number of anything in a sequence. What he talks about with causal finitism, I have the exact definition. Right? Causal finitism is a position that says every event has a finite causal history. He says nothing about the number of events. All he says basically is a hypothetical. If you have an infinite number of events, you can only connect finitely many of them at a time. Okay? That's what causal finitism says. It has nothing to do with how many events there are in total. That's beyond its jurisdiction. It doesn't care. And this is actually why I want to distinguish between sets and sequences. Okay? The number of events can be thought of as the set. When you link them causally, you think of them as a sequence. So you can only have sequences with finitely many uninterrupted events at a time in the sequence. But that's to say nothing about the set you pull things from, nor anything else about the sequence. Okay, so that's one of the reasons why I harped on the sets versus sequences thing at the beginning. It turns out it's really, really important. Okay, so I think that causal finitism, now that I got this big disclaimer out of the way, allows for an infinite past in the general sense of something came before something came before something. Now, it won't be a causally connected past history, but I mean, for many atheistic accounts of the universe, it doesn't have to be. Not that I'm an atheist or trying to justify one, but I'm saying that an atheist could hold this position with certain models and bear no metaphysical costs. So let me give you an example. So let's look at the difference between finitism and causal finitism, right? So finitism, again, there can only ever be finite limiting events, no matter what. Causal finitism, if there are an infinite number of events, only finitely many may be causally linked at a time, right? That's what I just said a little bit ago. So imagine there's a cyclical universe model in which if a universe is collapsed into a singularity, all unique facts about that universe and its history are lost, right? So a universe expands, a bunch of stuff happens, planets, stars, aliens, wars, Star Wars happens in one of these universes or something, right? And collapses back to a singularity. Well, once it hits a singularity, imagine that all the information's erased, right? You just have this compacted matter, a bunch of chaotic energy. There's no intelligibly talking about what came before it. It doesn't make any sense, right? It's like you shook the etch a sketch. Everything's gone, okay? And then the universe expands into a whole new universe, and that universe will last for some finite amount of time in its own space time or whatever, and then it'll collapse again as well. And so you can imagine this model, which you have an infinite number of expansions and contractions, just like that. And as long as the singularity shakes the etch a sketch and wipes out everything about the universe that came before it, this is a perfectly fine model under causal finitism. Right? Causal finitism has nothing whatsoever to gainsay this model because every present event in the universe has a finite causal history going back to its initial moment of expansion. Before that's a singularity. And who knows what happened before that singularity, right? All causal information's erased at the moment of singularity. And so you would never link causal historical events in a previous universe to this one. You would have the vague notion that there was another universe before this one. But it's a it's a fact about the past, but it's not like a causal historical fact about the past. A causal historical fact would be like so and so is this person's parent, right? There's a causal relationship there linking the two things through time via cause and effect. Um, that's the distinction here. So that kind of cyclical universe model is perfectly fine under causal finitism, so long as each universe is causally independent of the previous one and the future ones, and so on. Then in that case, you could FOIL premise two of the Kalam with this model, and there's no problem. So I want to point out to Malpass and Joe and other people in this discussion that they talk about very high metaphysical commitments with causal finitism and whatnot, but they talk about causal finitism as if it is just finitism. It just baffles the mind, right? Proust is desperately trying to avoid finitism, like with all the power he can muster. If they really were that close, Proust would just bite the bullet and say to hell with it. I'll just be a finitist. And he wouldn't waste his time writing this book and talking about these finer points. So there's got to be some there that somebody's not getting. Okay, enough of my rant. So let's look at a causal finitist solution of the Grim Reaper paradox, right? Because I've demonstrated like how it theoretically could work. We have these cool paradoxes. I claim causal finitism can solve them. So does Proust. Proust will say that only finite number of Reapers will come after Fred at a time or something like that. Uh, and that might be where this conflation with finitism comes from, is that Proust's solutions will look a lot like finitist solutions, because I don't think that he's really stretched his theory and saw what it allows to its full extent. So here's my solution that I've been using for a long time for the Grim Reaper paradox. Now, before we go into it, remember all the asterisks that we talked about earlier on in the presentation. I said, hey, you should take notes on these, right? Now they're about to be super, super relevant. So we're going to start changing every premise, rule, so forth that had that asterisk by adding some angels, right? So the asterisks are all about the fact that if Fred's dead, he stays dead and he's only visited by Reapers. And we're going to change that. So Fred's going to be visited by angels mixed in with the Reapers that will revive Fred if ever he's killed. And we're going to make sure that there's only finitely many Reapers between two angels. Once we've done that, the paradox is solved. How? Well, again, ask if Fred's alive at some time, 10:30. Well, before we said, look, nothing can bring Fred back to life if he's killed, so he couldn't have been killed at 10:15. Now, something can bring Fred back to life if he's killed. So we don't know exactly what happened before 10:15, but Fred probably was alive because he was resurrected by an angel. If there was a Reaper at 10:15, Fred'd be dead, right? So it's probably the case that if Fred's alive, whatever else happened, an angel got him, he's alive, and then a Reaper can kill him at 10:30. And look at that, voila, we've solved the problem. There's no contradiction. There is no ah, uh, Fred must be dead at all points in time if he was alive because of the if rule. Nope, Angel actually broke that chain. You can now take a nuanced position where Fred may have been dead earlier, and an angel revived him, and another Reaper killed him, and so on. You can also change this assumption in the case where he's dead and see if you can puzzle your way through that. I encourage you to stop the video, go back, and see if you can apply this angel rule to it and see if you can figure out, similarly to me, how you'd puzzle your way out of the paradox that way. Now, in all cases, you'll solve it. You'll have this non contradictory account of why Fred might be alive or dead at any time in which he is alive or dead. So that's great. So, what did the angels change exactly? Well, it didn't change the Bernadetti rule, right? The Reapers are still going to behave just as they would. Suppose an angel revives Fred, there's going to be a bunch of Reapers that come after it. The first of those Reapers will kill Fred, the other ones will fail to because the first one got him, which is exactly what the Bernadetti rules tell the Reapers to do. So nothing's changed as far as the Bernadetti rules are concerned. What else could change? The infinite sequence of Reapers didn't change, right? All you did is take the infinite sequence of Reapers and kind of spread them out by 1 unit or something and create little gaps. Then sprinkle angels in there so that between any finite cluster of Reapers there are 2 angels, right? So you've kind of made more room, but you haven't really decreased the number of Reapers at all. There's still an infinite number of them, both in the set, right? God's still grabbing from his grab bag of an infinite number of Reapers, but also in the sequence. There's not it's not like there's a finite number of Reapers in total. Well, that's cool. So that means that the unsatisfiable pair isn't an unsatisfiable pair. That's my other gripe with the unsatisfiable pair. Not only is it absolutely useless if you're trying to use it as a tool for talking about, let's say, the kalam, like absolutely garbage. It's not going to help you at all. But it turns out it's just not true that the two are unsatisfiable. I've come with a very, very simple way of tweaking one of the minor rules in the periphery about nothing else visits Fred, and if Fred's dead, he stays dead. Right? One minor tweak, and the paradox is solved, while still allowing the quote unquote unsatisfiable pair. So that's my reason for thinking the pair is not unsatisfiable, even if it weren't a silly strategy to try anyway. So that's that. Okay. What do I think is true instead? I think that we have an unsatisfiable triple, right? Not a pair. And then some of the people in my comment section are joking with me and being like, "Oh yeah, just wait 5 weeks. Logos will say it's it's an unsatisfiable quadruple or something." Maybe. I don't think so. I think this covers all the bases. I think if you look at all the bullet points and all the rules, I think I've kind of weaseled my way through to tinker with as little as possible to get what I've got. So okay. So the triple would be the Bernadetti rule, the infinite sequence of Reapers, and the fact there's no interruptions in the sequence. If Fred's dead, he stays dead, only Reapers, only job applications, all for the same job, so on and so on and so forth. Somebody can't be hired, not hired. Things like that, right? No interruptions. That's super important. And now there's 3 of them, right? Again, observing a contradiction between the 3 isn't enough. If you want to actually make a claim in opposition to a premise, like say for the Kalam or something else, you're going to have to do something, right? So if you want to contradict finitism, right, finitism suspends number 2. If you want to contradict finitism, you're going to have to either give up causality, say, oh, there's an infinite past, but causality was wonky or nothing ever happened, or you can allow an infinite past in a Bernadetti rule and just put a tiny little proviso on it in the form of causal finitism. Right? It costs you very little in the grand scheme of things to do it. So there you have it. Okay, let's go back to the catch-22 paradox because it's more physical, tangible than the Grim Reaper paradox. You can kind of understand the exasperated state this HR person's in trying to, fill this job. So what could we do analogously to solve this? Well, let's suppose that instead of an infinite stack of job applications looking for the same job, let's suppose that you have a bunch of different jobs and you have finitely many job applications in files applying for an infinite number of jobs. And so you have a stack of files for jobs, and you'll just, pull each jobs file off the stack, look at it, see who the first applicant was because it was first come, first serve, and stamp them. They get the job. Then you move on to the next job, stamp them. Move on to the next job, stamp them, right? Then it's fine. Well, then it's a bummer because you have an infinite number of jobs to go through. But hey, we're in an infinite number of an infinite universe. So I mean, I don't think there's retirement. I think the HR person will be happy that they have a job for infinity, given that the universe lasts for infinity. I guess. So there you have it. I mean, it's a little weird to hire an infinite number of people, but if you're in an infinite universe with an infinitely old corporation and so on, it's not that weird, all things considered. But we've solved the paradox. There's no contradiction in that statement. There's no catch 22 that freezes the HR worker and keeps them from doing work. Yay, go causal finitism. Okay, so what now? So to conclude this presentation, the Grim Reaper paradox is an interesting thought experiment about the nature of cause and causal history, right? Just thinking about the Bernadetti rules, what happens if you get rid of them, what that does to our talk of history and cause. Fascinating. Whether you're Christian, non-Christian, I mean, I don't really care. I'm not thinking about this trying to push any particular agenda. My goal is to clarify the conversation, right? So I just think it's a fascinating topic. The Grim Reaper paradox is resolvable without resorting to tossing the story out, nor committing to finitism, right? So if a Kalam proponent says that you can't resolve this paradox without appealing to a finite past, you can now say, no, I'm a causal finitist, and I think you can have an infinite past as long as you do it intelligently, carefully, that deals with these problems. Causal finitism does not entail a finite past, only a finite past history for your particular present, but you could have infinitely many past histories before yours, as long as your history is independent from ones that came before you. Anyone using causal finitism to positively argue for the Kalam then should be very careful. If they want an absolute beginning of events, they need strict finitism or causal finitism plus something. And I haven't heard a good something to add on to it yet that would support that premise. So, I hope this was interesting for you. I was told that the Grim Reaper paradox was of great interest to the audience of this channel, and I hope that this presentation of it uh, kind of, I don't know, got people on board if there's something that was confusing them. And I hope that most of all, you don't look at the attempt to solve the paradox as some kind of partisan issue. Like, you think it has to be solved if you're like a theist or a Christian, you're trying to push a Kalam agenda or something. Because that's definitely not me. I don't like the Kalam argument personally, but I still think addressing these paradoxes is of importance. So hopefully that extra bit of nuance people will find valuable. And so I think I'll conclude with that. Thank you for watching my video.